last lesson. And it is due to unfortunate circumstances that Brother Richard Massey was not able to be here with us, but we are blessed to have Brother Jack Williams give this lesson, this final lesson of this lectureship. Now, since Jack was not scheduled to speak, we did not prepare the bio for me to read, so that means I can probably say just about anything I want. You know, it's not just a coincidence. This is the 35th annual Midwest Lectures, and Jack and Lana have been with this congregation 35 years. We've heard many preachers before that have told us about unfortunate circumstances that they have endured because of preaching the sound word and being asked to leave congregations that had become unsound. And that is unfortunate. We have been fortunate at this congregation to have Jack and Lana and their family with us these 35 years. I have had the privilege to serve with those elders, those men that were instrumental in beginning this lectureship. And Jack has been working on this 35 years now. And it's amazing to see that it has continued the way it has, and the wonderful lessons that we've had each year. Now, I've not been here that many years. I've only been here since 1985. Well, I haven't been here 35 years. Close, but not quite 35 years. But it's also been an honor and a privilege to serve as an elder with Brother Jack, as he has become an elder here with this congregation also. And we're thankful for those men that have been influential in his growth. As he became a Christian, Brother Mike spoke of that in his prayer, and the closeness that he has with Brother Tony, and the influence that men like that have had on him. We look forward to each and every lesson that he does bring from this pulpit. And we know that he is going to do a wonderful job of breaking the bread of life to us as we look to this lesson this evening, knowing that there can arise another generation that knows God if we teach them true contentment. Brother Jack has many times talked about when he became a Christian, he realized that he not only needed to make a change in his life, but he needed to be involved in spreading the word, and soon began that journey as he went to preaching school and became a preacher. Now, having had the opportunity to serve with the previous elders, many of you know the story of how Jack and Lana came to Independence, Missouri, from that little state down in Texas. And Lana was very much pregnant with Mary. Well, it just so happens that Mary was born when they were here, and Jack was preaching for the first time and trying out for the position as the preacher here at 39th Street. The elders previously have told me time and time again they couldn't tell him that he didn't have the job after they'd gone through so much. We look forward to that lesson this evening from Jack.
A lesson on contentment. I'm content. Just stop now and we can just listen to the recording of what they said over and over. It sounds really good to me. No. I do appreciate the opportunity to speak. I regret so deeply what Richard Massey and his family are going through. I cannot imagine the heartache that they're having to deal with at this time. But our prayers have been with them. There have been many who have communicated with them, and I know that Richard was muchly needed there and needed to be around his family, not only for them, but for himself. And I know that his presence there has been of just so immense value to them. He is a good and godly man, and in a time of trouble, you want some like him around. And I know that it has been a great blessing, but we are heartbroken at what they're having to face. But that means that you have to put up with me. I am thankful that I am able to serve with these elders. One of the things, I always hear about the lectures in Jack. And if you'll notice the area congregations that have been represented through the time, this lectureship has gone on because of an eldership who had a vision and had a congregation that stood with them. And aside from that, area congregations that determined to labor together, that the truth could be set forth in this area, not only here. You look out on the board, the gospel meetings, the ladies' days, all of these things coming up. These are things that we labor together for. And this is just one of the works. I think it's a grand and wonderful work, but it is a cooperative work. And I'm so thankful for every individual, every congregation that encourages this work in the ways that it can. So I'm thankful for that. Thankful that we are here tonight. Thankful for each and every lesson that's going on. And I can say, I ask you about how do you feel about that? Are you satisfied? Are you fulfilled? Are you happy? Are you filled with pleasure over it? Do you have a self-satisfaction because of it? Those are all definitions of contentment that you find. And that's what is brought forth in so many things in our life as we look at it and we see that contentment is something that's so grand in our life. It's so essential. One of the greatest tools the devil has is discontentment. You look in God's plan throughout the Scriptures. Whenever sin came into the world, God revealed in Genesis 3:15 that there would be the one who came at the seed of a woman who would destroy the power of the devil, and everything between those 2 points is that golden thread that comes forth, that God loves you. As Tony said in John 3:16, God so loved and put your name there that He gave His only begotten Son. But the whole of God's Word is the presentation and preparation for that love to be demonstrated by His Son. And you see so many times that God's children, as they became discontent, the devil worked and preyed upon them and sought to overthrow God's goal of saving souls. Probably the most well-known examples are found in the book of Numbers, as the people just murmured over and over. I was blessed to study under the tutelage of Wendell Winkler. And I remember Wendell very clearly as he would talk about the word murmur and how terrible it was. And he said, you can just listen to it and it's murr, and how terrible it sounds. Well, you go to the book of Numbers, and every time the children got something, they wanted something different or something more. They were not content. They were not satisfied. They were not fulfilled. They did not see any pleasure. Give me more. And the devil got inroads. He never won. We knew he wouldn't. But the battle raged, and it still rages today because we're in a society in which people always want something different, something more. There is no self-satisfaction. There is no happiness. There is no fulfillment in the hearts and minds of so many people. And that is a tool of the devil, because it opens the door for anything and everything that you can imagine as they envy the things round about them. But in the Bible, there's also the lesson that people find contentment in many different ways. You look and you find, as you look in Genesis 3, God had placed man and woman in the most amazing situation that you can imagine. There in the garden, everything they needed supplied. I cannot imagine. You know, I've said at times and tried to conceive what the garden looked like. And its beauty is just really beyond my grasp totally. But in the midst of all that, God said, you know, there is this tree. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Thou shalt not eat of it. In the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. Well, then you find Eve in Genesis 3. And something about it, she wasn't content at that point. She had everything, but something, it seems, in her mind was lacking. She's longingly looking at this tree, it seems. So the serpent is there. And he says, eat it. She says, no, we can't. And then the serpent says, you know, you'll not die. God knows that at the time that you eat that, you'll become as gods, knowing good and evil. In other words, you'll be able to make your own decisions. You won't have to listen to him. You won't have to be under his authority. You'll be able to determine what's right and wrong. So she took and she ate. She was content at that point. She'd gotten what she wanted. You look and you find Cain in chapter 4. God had, again, given commands. You go to Hebrews, the 11th chapter, verse 4. Abel offered by faith a more excellent sacrifice. We know that means God gave specifics on here's how the sacrifice is to be. Cain didn't follow the commands. But whenever he saw that God had that acceptance, he looked upon Abel and his sacrifice with favor and not upon Cain. What did Cain do? Got his brother out in the field, slew him. He was content. You see, he sought that. He sought to still be the one. He sought not to have his brother be able to look at him and despise him because of what he had done. He sought to make sure that his birthright was protected because he was the oldest. He was content. You look and you find in Genesis 6, God had brought man to this point, and now man knew of the creation. They knew of, no doubt, Cain and Abel. They knew of God's demands, but we're told that Noah's peers, they weren't content with following the ways of God. And so we find that the sons of God looked upon the daughters of men. And that's not angels. It's not angels coming down and cohabiting. That's one of the most foolish doctrines you've ever heard, but people try to put it in there. But all it means is here are the holy individuals, the ones whom you will next read about like Noah. And they said, we're not going to do that. We want something. We want to be like other people. And so they went into those people. And the result was, one of the lessons we had was being careful of the companions you choose, have heaven in mind. They chose companions that turned them away from God. And every thought of their heart was on evil continually. But it seems they were content. Noah was a preacher of righteousness, but they were happy with what they were doing. They were in that sin, and they loved to have it so. You go to Judges 7 and Achan. Here the children of God had fought the battle of Jericho. Resounding victory. But now they go against Ai, and whenever they go, they're defeated. But it's soon found out there's sin in the camp. And what had happened? God had told them of the treasures, the spoil of Jericho. You don't take anything. That's dedicated to God. But Achan, he wasn't content with that. But what he did, you find in Judges 7, he saw the Babylonish garment, silver and the gold. He coveted them. He took them. He was content. He fulfilled his desire. He was happy the way things were then. You find Saul in the New Testament. In the book of Acts, the 7th through the 9th chapter, you find him as he's going forth, and he is breathing out slaughterings against the disciples of the Lord. By his own admission, as he wrote to Timothy, he was a murderer. He sought to destroy the things of God. He did it in ignorance. No excuse, though. Still needed to be forgiven for it. But he was content. You see, contentment is happiness, satisfaction, fulfillment. I've done what is my pleasure. All of those things were there in those lives. And in our world today, you still see the same thing. Everybody goes after what their pleasure is, what their desires are. A lot of people in this world are content. My brother down in Texas, he talks many times about people, they seem to rise to a level. You know, it's like if you throw something into water, it's going to float at a level, its own level. If there's something about its mass that causes it to be a bit lower or higher, it's just finally going to settle there. His philosophy is people are that way. I mean, they have goals, aspirations, and that's where they go. Well, that's what these people did. But they were wrong and they were in sin. And this world today is filled with people who are content, but they're wrong, they're in sin. You see, they live this life, it is not in accord with the will of God. What it is in accord with is a warning that God has given. In 1 John 2 and verse 15 through 17, he says, "Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world." The things in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, these things are not of the Father. And yet, what is it that Eve and Cain and Noah's peers and Achan and Saul and so many in the world and in the church today go after? What makes them happy? What makes them feel fulfilled? What makes them joyous? What makes them content? But it ends up in sin because they're not seeking the things of God. They're much like Paul wrote about in his day. He wrote in the Philippian letter in chapter 2 and verse 20 where he had no man like-minded, like Timothy, who would naturally look upon the things of others, but every man looked upon their own. Eve wasn't concerned about Adam whenever she ate the fruit. I think Adam probably had an inordinate concern for Eve whenever she gave it to him and he took it. He didn't have a proper desire for her or himself either. But you look and you find that there are so many who their goal, their desire is simply not governed, guided by anything that is godly. You look and you see the things in this world. You know, there's a tract in the foyer that I wrote, and it's not any good just because I wrote it, but I think it has some good things in it. It's entitled A World Without God. And that's what you see. That's what you see in the type of contentment that the world looks at. Whenever Eve sought the contentment that she had, you find that she sought to simply do the things that were good for her. Whenever Cain did, whenever Achan did, all of these people, they were looking and desiring to put God out of the picture and to put themselves in. And so what they ended up with, if you go back and you read the things that transpired because of that, it reads like our world today. A world that is filled with immorality. You know, in the Roman letter, whenever people refuse to retain the knowledge of God, in other words, I don't want God in here, he causes too much trouble. That's too strict. We don't want that. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. Romans 1 reads like today's newspaper about all of the immorality that comes forth in their lives. Whenever you take God out of the picture, there's a world without answer at all. People look, and I think it was Michael or somebody talked about some man went to find himself. He didn't find an answer out there. But that's what people do. Why am I here? Where did I come from? Where am I going? Is there a purpose in life? Whenever I look and my contentment goes just by looking at self and taking God out of the picture, there's no answer. And so I turn to things, in Tony's day, long before mine. People turn to different types of psychedelic drugs because they could get in touch with themselves. That's without God. Without God, you don't have a way to get in touch. And you don't have any hope. A world that is without God is without hope. So if I look and my contentment is based upon not looking to anything of God, but rather looking to the things of the world, what is my hope? You see these people, sadly, through the years, there are things you try to block out of your mind that you don't even want to think about. How many times have you read and heard about people that took their lives? I mean, that's the epitome of it. There are sometimes whenever people are just simply, they lose mental capability for various reasons. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who make a suicide pact because why not? We're sick of this life of trying to find out who I am. We're sick of this life that I went after all the pleasures and they weren't what I thought they were whenever I first saw them. So let's just end it all. What a horrific thing that is. But if you don't have any hope, why not? If this is it, the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, if even in this life, if you put God in the picture even, but you put it to this life, rewind to Randy's lesson of false teachers, and Lana says not to say this, but I can't think of any other way to say it. Stupid doctrines like AD 70. According to them, this is it. Paul says if in this life only we have hope in Christ Jesus, we're of all men most pitiable. How horrific that people don't even have hope in Christ here. They put God out of the picture. It's all there. And thus it's a world filled with loneliness. So many people in this world, they look. They say, if God is real, how can this happen? Or how could he let this happen to me? How could he let this happen to Richard Massey, his nieces? Things like that happen. Not because God doesn't care, but because people put God out of their lives. We live in a world of consequence. You take God out of the picture, and you get the drunk drivers. You get the smokers who get cancer. You get the people who drive by and shoot somebody when they get mad at them. Why not? If there is no God, there is no basis for that. The terrible things in this world aren't a consequence of a God who doesn't care, but they're the consequence of people who don't care about God. And their contentment is in serving self and doing whatever gets them that self-gratification at the moment. So if it is strapping a bomb on them and walking into your crowd, so be it. That is a horrible world that we even conceive of, look at, think of, that might have to do with contentment in the eyes of people. But in so many minds, that's it. But the reality is, God says, there's something better. There's something that you and I have and deserve and ought to have in our lives that makes us not a problem in this world, but that we, as we seek contentment, we're a benefit to this world. And Paul addresses it. In 1 Timothy 6, he points out, he talks about, beginning in verse 1, about servants. If you're under a yoke, count your own masters worthy of honor. If you have believing masters, well, don't despise them. And he talks about the evil things of false teachers around. But then in verse 6, He says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. You know what the world thinks? Contentment is great gain. Go for whatever I want. Go for all the gusto you can get. You only go around once in life. It's your life. You live it your way. All of these things are there. But God added this little bitty word there. This word with. Godliness with contentment. Those two are joined together. You know, in Matthew 9, there's a principle set forth. It's applied specifically to marriage there. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. God says you don't have the right. Well, what about here? People do it in faith only. You know, faith and works. God joined those. We get all upset and uptight, and rightly so, whenever people say you're saved by faith only, and you say, no! God says you have to have faith that is coupled with works. Faith without works is dead. But then somehow we get it, and it's running headlong into the church. Contentment is great gain. However, God says to worship, I don't really like that. You know, I think you ought to have heartfelt worship. Let's have some spirit-led worship. Let's have some leadership that's there, that's popular. We don't worry. These qualifications, they get in the way. This oneness of the church stuff, that's going to run people off. I mean, all of that you see, and we ought to stand up and be horrified. We get mad at the Baptists, but we condone that amongst our brethren. And how horrible it is in the world, but it's beyond horrible in the church. And yet we live in a society, and it is running headlong into the church, that all that matters is yours and my contentment. Are you happy with this? Did this lesson make you feel happy and joyful? You know, Jeremy's son is thinking about becoming a psychiatrist. And I said some things pretty straightforward to him the other day. He looked at me, and I think he thought I was kidding, and he found out I wasn't. If he can become a psychiatrist and hold godly principles, he's going to be one of the most valuable people in the medical field you can ever imagine. But if he goes the way of most psychiatrists, he's going to be a bane to the church and a bane to society. I get so sick. I've been present whenever psychiatrists have discussed things with people. Well, how does that make you feel? Are you happy? Does that bring you pleasure? Well, that's about the time that I'm ready to say goodbye. You know, you look, and we need to realize that God has said contentment is essential. A people who aren't content, they're going to be the workers of the devil. But this contentment has to be learned, restrained, guided by godliness. Godliness with contentment is great gain. You cannot have a proper contentment without God in the picture. And so you look and you say, okay, well, what are we going to do then? How are we going to do that? Well, first of all, we're going to realize that God looks at the world, and really by the giving of His Son, whenever sin came into this world, the Hebrew writer said in Hebrews 6 and verse 9, he says, Beloved, we are persuaded better things of you. We're persuaded better things of you and things that accompany salvation, though we thus speak. He was warning them, you've got all sorts of problems, but we're persuaded you can come out of this. They were content not to be teachers. They were content not to grow. God says, no, that's not going to work. You need to have contentment that is guided by His will. So godliness with contentment. So how are we going to do this? You go to 1 Timothy 6 and you find a few key things there. You point out, first of all, if you're going to have godliness with contentment, if we don't teach the future generations about God, I've heard preachers define godliness. What does godliness mean? Godliness means God-likeness. In other words, my decisions, my life, the way I live, the way I speak, the things I do, they are going to set forth God before others. I don't become divine. But in Matthew 5:16, I let my light so shine that men can see my good works and glorify the Father which is in heaven. I mirror the things of God in the life that I live, the choices I make. Jesus suffered and died, leaving us an example that we should follow in his footsteps. So the first thing we've got to do is put a priority on teaching them about God. We've had lessons on the fact you can know God is. The heavens declare that. Psalm 19 and verse 1. The writer in Romans said, people are without excuse if they say there is no God. I mean, that's inexcusable. But what does God say about himself? Without that book, you'll never know. Without that book, future generations won't know. So you teach the Word. You teach them about God. One of the pivotal things in this is going to be that we love God. That we are willing to sacrifice self for him because of that love we have. The writer in 1 John says, we love him because he first loved us. We don't teach our children about who God is, what he's done, what he is doing, what he will do, the love that is behind and focused upon us and all those things. How can we expect them to even understand what godliness is? If all they know about God is, in the beginning God created, God told Noah to build an ark, God took Moses through the wilderness, and we don't have the individuals who put the you in there, the basis, the reason, the focus in there. I've said before, at this congregation, we have amazing Bible teachers. We have amazing Bible students who listen to that and learn. Here is why God created it. Here is why the ark was built. Here is why Moses led them through the wilderness. Here's why. Each one of those comes back to our salvation. We speak the things of salvation. Godliness, knowing God, knowing of the salvation provided through him, the hope that is provided is essential. If we're to have another a generation come forth that knows God as they understand contentment. But then, based upon that, he goes on in verse 7, and he says, for godliness with contentment is great gain. For, by the way, circle that word for, and right beside it, G-A-R, and then beside that, Acts 2:38. A lot of people make this idea, you're baptized for the remission of sins. And word for means because. Well, here it clearly means that, doesn't it? That G-A-R, the Greek word, it's a little word, it's pronounced gar. And it means because of. God could have used that in Acts 2:38. He didn't. Why? Because the word in Acts 2:38 looks forward to something. Not a basis of something to be done, but the basis of doing it for, in order to receive. But anyway, he uses that. Because we are to have godliness with contentment, because we teach them of the finality, the brevity, and the transient nature of this life. Notice what he says. We brought nothing into this world, and it's certain we can carry nothing out. Simple statement. But what it tells me is I came into this world one way. I'm going out the same way. I was there at the birth of both of my children. I saw them the moment they were born, and they were naked. They didn't bring anything with them. And whenever they go out, whenever they stand before God, they're not going to take anything out of this world with them. So this verse teaches, here you need to realize, and you need to be careful how we do it. You don't scare children, but you make them realize death is part of the process. Hebrews 9 and verse 27. My grandchildren, my children, they know I'm going to die one day. We hope it's not going to be soon. I want to stick around and torment them. But death's a reality. And we need to realize that it can come to each of us. And we don't know when it's going to be. James 4, our life is a vapor that appeareth for a little time, vanisheth away. Everybody says, well, the death was so unexpected. I don't really know anybody whose death wasn't unexpected. Even people who have terminal illness, they always think, well, a few more minutes, a few more hours, or what, and death comes. So whether it be by virtue of Richard Massey's nieces, both of them in their 30s, their life ended. I mean, you go through and look at the different ages, but life is brief. And so we look at this life, whenever we do that, you go on and, you're in the house and everybody says, okay, get everything together, we're fixing to go on this trip. This morning or at noon, Dennis and I were talking to Robert, Luke, and Bill about going to a Disney vacation. And he said, okay, we're leaving next Tuesday. I can guarantee you they're making preparation. That's something important. And so you want to get ready for that. If we teach our young people this life is transient, this life is just a step on the way to something else. We're going out of this world sometime. Get ready. That's what life is. It's a preparation for what is to come. And that's what he's saying. Godliness with contentment is great gain, because we brought nothing into this world and we're going to carry nothing out, but we're going. So you get ready. You get ready for that time that we're going to stand before the judgment throne. You get ready for that time that we're going to give answer for the things that we have done in this body. And then you teach them about the staying power of things in this life. That you came in with nothing, you're going out with nothing. If I'm looking to heaven and I realize the brevity of this life, is there anything wrong with having a nice car, nice clothes, a nice house? No. But they're not going to consume me. You see, the love of money is the root of evil. That is, if I look at this, this is it. What are you going to do in life? Oh, I'm going to make money. What are you going to do in life? I'm going to get a bigger house. What are you going to do? I'm going to drive this kind of car. If that's where our thoughts are, then we've forgotten what's going to happen. I remember my father, when I was growing up, he said, son, you buy a new car, thing you ought to do is, first of all, is go outside, take a hammer, and hit it in the side. By the way, he never did that. But his point was, it's going to get dented. It's going to wear out. He thought it was just ludicrous. Somebody buy a new car, then they'd park 2 blocks from the store so they wouldn't be around anything and walk in there. What'd you buy the car for? It's only temporary. And you teach them these things. And then you teach them the difference between need and want. Having food and raiment, therewith be content. I'd sit there and I'd tell my dad, Daddy, I need this, I need this. He'd look and say, son, you don't even know what need is. I wanted all sorts of things in my life. You think it's just a coincidence that God said having food and raiment? In other words, you have your physical sustenance supplied. You have a meal on the table. You have the physical needs, the water, the food, all these things. And you have raiment. That is, you have the clothes, you have a roof over your head. Be content. You've got what you need. It puts other things in perspective, and so our contentment isn't based upon the things of the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. It's based upon the things that are essential for me to live a godly life. And then I tell them, if you don't do that, if you want to go after all the money, he says there in verse 9 and 10, they that will be rich, here's what you want, they fall into temptation and a snare. I mean, go through and study with your children about what happens whenever people, all they want is money. They're never satisfied. They want more and more and more. And then whenever they get that more, they're so worried about protecting it, they do evil to other people to do it, and other people do evil to them to get it. I mean, it's just a snowball effect of evil that comes forth whenever that is your goal in life. And that's what he says. But then teach them. You've got a choice. You know, I can remember growing up, my dad would tell me over and over, he'd say, son, if I was you, and he'd give me some advice, but you do what you want. He'd give me the advice. He'd warn me about making the wrong choices. He'd encourage me about making the right. And he said, son, you do what you want. You see, I had a choice. Every one of us has a choice. I can go for all the gusto. I can look after the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. I can desire to be rich. I can desire to have bigger and better barns. Or I can desire to look to God. Because godliness is now that guiding factor in my life. I study about God. I know about God. I love God. And the more I love, he loves me, the more I love him. So I looked at his commandments. And I put them into action. I'm now laying up treasure in heaven. Like the thing said, you know, you can't take it with you, but you send it ahead. And that's what Christian living is. You lay up treasure in heaven. You can't love God and mammon. You got to make a choice. You choose God. And you seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and the things that come forth in life that we live are such that I have chosen. I've chosen it in this life. Yeah, things are going to happen to me, but I've learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. Apostle Paul said that in Philippians 4. Perhaps the most important thing about that is in verse 13. How do you do that, Paul? I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. So you back to the godliness again. I'm with God. I've learned to be abased. I've learned to abound. That doesn't matter. Because I have one goal in mind. I press on towards the prize, the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. Why? Because I've learned that godliness with contentment is great gain, and that is my choice. So tonight, where are we? What have we chosen? Throughout this week, we have had lesson after lesson. Being an elder, being a teacher, being a preacher, being a parent, being a child, being a member of society, being one who prays, being one who studies. All of those things are going to be guided by what we choose on our contentment. Godliness with contentment is great gain. If I have that, I'm going to be that elder. I'm going to be that deacon. I'm going to be that elder's wife, that deacon's wife, that child. I'm going to be that teacher. I'm going to be that parent. All of these things are going to come forth. Because that's what's going to satisfy me in my godliness. Saul thought he had it. In Acts 9, he found that in all of that, he was still persecuting Christ. He had a choice to make. He went unto Damascus, where he was told to go, and he was told what to do. His life of true contentment began whenever he was not disobedient, but whenever he was told by Ananias, that certain disciple, why tarriest thou? Rise and be baptized. Wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. He did that. And then he rose. I mean, he went straightway into the synagogues preaching Christ. Did he suffer loss? Yeah. He had godliness with contentment. Do you want to begin that life? We can all do it or return to it as we stand and sing the song of invitation.
Would you be free from the burden